Thank you for joining us today. My name is Soledad Alvarado, and I'm the Climate Justice Fellow at Waterfront Alliance. Waterfront Alliance is a US-based nonprofit with a network of more than 1,100 partners committed to climate resilience, economic opportunity, and equitable access to and along shorelines, waterfronts, and coastlines throughout the New York, New Jersey region and beyond. Recognizing that climate resilience extends beyond flooding and coastal storms, we are also exploring strategies to address extreme heat, one of the most significant and growing climate challenges facing our region. From expanding access to water and cooling resources to advancing blue-green infrastructure and community-led planning, we bring together communities, policymakers, and industry leaders to create a more sustainable, equitable, and climate-ready future. During this panel, we'll discuss how extreme heat is now New York City's deadliest climate threat, causing hundreds of preventable deaths each summer and hitting low-income and chronically ill New Yorkers the hardest. Yet, many high-risk neighborhoods still lack adequate cooling resources. Some areas had only 2 cooling centers for over 160,000 residents during recent heat waves. It's my honor to introduce you to our panelists today. Jada Twilla from South Bronx Unite is an environmental justice educator, where she works alongside residents to address environmental health challenges and build community power in the South Bronx. Her work focuses on climate justice, air quality, public health, and community-based advocacy, helping connect environmental research with grassroots action. Jada brings a strong background in environmental biology and public health and is passionate about advancing equitable, community-driven climate solutions. Caleb Smith is the New York City policy manager at We Act for Environmental Justice, where they lead policy advocacy efforts focused on environmental justice and climate resilience. Caleb is a lead facilitator of the Extreme Heat Coalition, which advances policies and programs to protect residents from heat stress through nature-based solutions, renewable energy, social resilience planning, and equitable climate adaptation strategies. Prior to joining We Act, Caleb served as a special assistant to the mayor of Oakland, working on environmental justice and community-led initiatives. They hold a bachelor's degree in politics from the University of San Francisco and a Master of Public Administration in Environmental Science and Policy from Columbia University. Katherin Sibel, MSUP, is a community climate resiliency coordinator with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. She works at the intersection of climate resilience and public health, supporting programs that help communities prepare for extreme heat, flooding, and other climate-related hazards. Katherin collaborates across city agencies and with community leaders to advance climate health initiatives, public education, and preparedness efforts. Prior to joining the Department of Health, she served as a community planning and capacity building reservist with FEMA, supporting long-term recovery planning following hurricanes, wildfires, and the COVID pandemic. She holds a Master's of Urban Planning degree from Columbia University and University of Puerto Rico, Piedras. Jessica Cruz serves as Deputy Director of Living Streets and Public Spaces at the New York City Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice. Her work focuses on protecting New Yorkers from extreme heat and poor air quality, advancing sustainable transportation initiatives, and expanding green infrastructure across the city. With more than a decade of experience in nonprofit and public sector leadership, Jessica has worked on issues ranging from equitable transit and affordable housing to community development and climate resilience. She holds a master's degree in urban planning from Columbia University and a bachelor's degree in urban studies from the University of California, Berkeley. Whew. That was a mouthful. I'm sorry. But you guys do a lot. And you guys are here with a lot of merit to you guys. So to get us started, I love to open with a broad question for everyone. Why should New Yorkers or why should New Yorkers view extreme heat as an urgent climate issue?
I
Caleb,
can get us kicked off. I mean, I think the most succinct way I've heard this put is that heat is a threat multiplier, and this goes for a variety of different social vulnerabilities too. So what that looks like is the more marginalized you are, the more likely you are to face higher heat risk. And on a larger macro level, when systems are not prepared, the consequences are multidimensional. So, especially with extreme heat, the damage is spread over longer and longer time scales. We're seeing this all the time with the heat season starting earlier and ending later. Just this year, I think we had an 80-degree day as early as March. And the way that this shows up in our lives is it impacts our finances with higher utility bills. It impacts our cognitive ability. Um, UCLA Luskin School has done a lot of research around this, especially looking at how well students are able to study, perform, and retain information during hot weather. And it impacts our health. Thinking about sleep quality, mental health, there's a lot of associations between irritability and even violent crime between extreme heat or with extreme heat. Um, and also, you mentioned disabled New Yorkers. Um, when people have things like asthma, COPD, other cardiac conditions, diabetes, all of those symptoms of those illnesses are worsened when people are exposed to extreme heat without relief. So it really stacks up.
Yes. Um, well said. And I would say also, I think that the media almost puts this idea in our heads that that summer is supposed to be a hot time, and to the point where I think that we kind of almost like overlook and have this idea that, oh, this is what summer's supposed to be. And what's going on is not normal, it's or it shouldn't be normalized, really, just like what's being said. And I think that we also just live in a culture of a country that's sick. And public health wise, there's a lot of concerns that don't interact well with the heat, and we don't really say it up front, what we do know. And so, for instance, like if you, like what's being said, if you know somebody that doesn't have AC, especially, or who's older, who's diabetic, who's dependent on drugs or alcohol, who is perhaps taking medications, this time of year is dangerous. And I think also, again, it's record breaking. This shouldn't be normalized. Again, all of these deaths are preventable. Just like last year, according to our report in June 2025, there was 19 heat stress deaths that took place. And I think what's alarming too, and going with that, is that it's taking place during days that aren't necessarily emergencies, that it can be 82 degrees. And that's the state of our infrastructure and how it was planned out and designed and executed, that someone can just walk outside and feel these impacts immediately. And so, yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's a multidimensional problem. So can't wait to talk about it more.
I would also add that not everyone has the same resources. So sometimes, there are neighborhoods that don't have enough trees, that don't have enough open spaces, that perhaps don't have like enough like or like a quick access to a cooling center. So not everyone has access to a cool space in their home, and not everyone has easy access to a cool space outside of their home. So I think those inequities definitely also play a role. As others have said, heat is a little bit less tangible for some people. Like you see a flood, you see a hurricane, you're kind of like those are visible kind of cues. Heat sometimes you're just kind of feeling hot, or you're like it can escalate really quickly. And unless you start to recognize and know the symptoms, like and know that you should like stay hydrated, get to a cool space, like the impacts can kind of build over time.
Yeah, and as mentioned, the cumulative impacts of some of these climate burdens that we experience just make extreme heat even more urgent, because one of the ways that environmental justice neighborhoods and communities, try to tackle some of the environmental health burden of climate, of pollution, of extreme weather events is actually by convening in public spaces that they have access to, or places that they can reclaim, like community gardens and parks. And so, as we see many of our community members making use of green spaces that, they've reclaimed and created as a place to have some respite from heat or air pollution or other environmental burdens, it's definitely still making people increase their exposure when they're outdoors, when they're farming, when they're gardening. And because these green space and nature-based solutions to the climate issues that we experience also kind of require our vulnerable New Yorkers to be exposed to the elements and be outdoors, it's really important that we support people in being able to have these community solutions to climate justice issues, while also, not limiting people's ability to enjoy the outdoors and enjoy the nature that they've created in their backyards.
Yeah, I couldn't say it better. So this next question goes to Kat. What does the data tell us about heat-related illness and mortality in New York City? Which populations are most at risk?
Yes, thanks for the question. So according to our report, Black and Latino New Yorkers have a higher likelihood of heat-exacerbated death compared to the rest of the city. And it's a reflection of past and present structural racism that creates economic, healthcare, housing, energy, all of these. It's just a main reflection of that playing out. And also, additionally, going in further, people who died from heat stress were most often exposed to dangerous heat conditions inside. So it's like built environment and the inside environment that they're living. So specifically, sorry, about looking at the sample size, I think it was about over 50%, specifically 52% that didn't have AC in their home, and then 48% of those deaths that took place had an AC, had an air conditioning, but it wasn't working or not in use because of affordability. And so, yes, and then what we also that tells us, taking it a step further, that my team looks at is so there is an air conditioning heat, and depending on where you live in your building and what way it faces, the direction to the sun, all of that, it can actually heat can get trapped and inside your building in your room, and it can stay for up to 3 days after a heat wave, and you can still experience heat exhaustion even if the 90-degree day passed, for instance. And so another interesting figure that we looked at was that in this exposure of dangerous conditions in the home, about a quarter, so 23% specifically, had an electric fan that was on, doing its thing. But that indicates that there's a certain temperature threshold that fans aren't enough to cool somebody down. So who specifically, especially if, like what was mentioned, if they have different risk factors like chronic health condition, mobility, all of these different aspects that overlap.
So the title of this webinar is called Overheated and Underserved. Jessica and Jada, why are environmental justice neighborhoods in particular experiencing more extreme heat than other places?
I can start. Thanks, Soledad. A lot of it is, a lot of neighborhoods are historically underserved and have been not received the same level of investment. So we definitely know that there are neighborhoods that don't have the same level of access to open spaces, to trees, less shade. We also know that sometimes, even though we are kind of actively planting, it takes time for trees to mature. So maybe some neighborhoods have received some recent tree plantings, but those take a couple of years, sometimes like a decade or two, for us to fully experience like the benefits. There are other things like less kind of waterfront access, less access to pools. And again, these spaces that like people go to cool down, what are the operating hours? You know, do people have access to swimming classes and things like that? Those are all things that kind of play a factor in kind of how like people are experiencing heat across the city. And then I would say there are things in the data that don't always show up. So sometimes people have to work outside, delivery workers or construction workers, people who work at airports. Sometimes we're seeing like an underreporting of like heat illnesses or heat impacts there. And then we also don't always know like what type of social infrastructure people have. So sometimes there are people who are in their homes and don't perhaps have someone who can check in on them, who maybe if their apartment is really warm, can say like, hey, come over and like cool down. But those are all things that we're not always seeing equally across the city.
Yeah, and I would also add, in addition to the issue of access, there is an issue of maintenance and actually making sure that some of these facilities or pieces of water infrastructure actually are being well maintained and functioning for the community members that rely on it. In the neighborhood of Mott Haven, Port Morris, there is significantly less access to cooling centers. And for, over 80,000 residents, there's only one place that all residents can access, all age groups, and that's the public library. And so when you think about 80,000 people experiencing extreme heat events or these uh still high heat days that aren't necessarily categorized as an emergency, it's really, really challenging to have equity in transportation and in housing and in uh, social infrastructure, like Jessica mentioned, because all these things compound. Like, in the South Bronx, Mott Haven, Port Morris, especially, we have some of the hottest bus stops in the city, and a lot of our neighborhood uses public transportation. And so when you're looking at a neighborhood of working class people who are relying on these public systems to get to work, get to school, get to where they need to go, it it just becomes challenging at every step of the process. Getting to the bus, walking to the bus, walking home from the bus, spending time indoors when you don't have proper cooling and ventilation. So yeah, these historical like limitations and issues of environmental racism that have affected the infrastructure of today, and also the lack of maintenance to make sure that a drinking water fountain is actually supplying water in a park, or a cooling center that's posted on the city's website is actually open. So currently, like even as of today, there's a cooling center listed on our city's Cool It Options website. It's the St. Mary's pool. But the St. Mary's Recreation Center in the South Bronx has been closed for many years. And, so someone might go use a resource and think that they have access to something and it's actually closed or it's not available. And then what do people do then? So yeah, lots and lots of issues of folks not even being able to kind of protect themselves using the resources available to them because they're unreliable and unmaintained.
So we spoke about equity a bit. I did wanted to expand on that a little bit just before we move on to the next question. What inequities are visible on the ground that may not show up in statistics or in the city's data?
I would say like one of the issues being spray showers or drinking water fountains, not being on all the time, people kind of having those interactions, knowing that those things exist, but that it's not available to them. And also the issue of actually getting to cooling spaces. So for example, the the area of the South Bronx that South Bronx Unite serves, our closest pool is in Hunts Point. And in order to get to that pool, you need to take the 6 train and also take a bus, and that still requires a 15-minute walk. And so, if we don't have clear pathways for people to be able to access some of these spaces, then it's a really, really large health burden that is put on the individual that's already hyper vulnerable to dealing with these issues. One of the programs that we did this summer with our summer youth employment program interns was actually field mapping some of the heat hazards that they observed while walking through the street or while walking from our South Bronx Unite office to the closest cooling center and figuring out like what parts of the street were shady or had enough canopy and how much exposure to heat people were experiencing just trying to get to a cooling center. And so some of those things don't come up in the city data, but it's things that community members are definitely aware of and that we should be documenting as well, because ultimately it'll help everyone be able to navigate extreme heat as an issue.
I would also
Yeah.
add to
Oh,
that. Oh, sorry. I would add to that there is also not very utilized or unclear ways of sort of tracking what those barriers are through community dialogue. Uh, the city encourages people to use mechanisms like 311, but there's no actual complaint code for you to talk about cooling centers, your experience at one, or your challenges actually getting to one, any of the barriers that Jada was just describing. In addition to that, both uh, Central and East Harlem, South Bronx have much higher elevation, uh, like higher elevated air quality issues than many other parts of the city and even nationally. Um, and there's not necessarily a great way to capture how industrial traffic, construction, all of these irritants in the air in real time are impacting uh, the quality of people's neighborhoods and how they're exacerbating asthma and other respiratory issues. Like we have emergency room visits, but there are a number of reasons why people may not interact with those systems even when they need them. So that really leads to an underestimation of what the day-to-day issues are.
Jessica, were you going to say something?
yeah, I was similar, gonna kind of describe that. Sometimes we know, for example, like we mentioned a lot about like AC access and who has air conditioning in their home, but sometimes we don't know like if someone can actually like turn it on. Like, can they afford to turn it on? How long can they afford to turn it on? Is that having an impact on like their quality of life? I think like those are kind of those like experiences that don't always show up in data. Similar, we know that people have to work outside or sometimes like limiting like their water intake because they don't have restroom access or don't have water access. So I think those are all the things that like we're trying to like create policy and legislation and solutions for. But there are experiences that people have in New York City that are not always super clear in the data, and it kind of increases the importance of us actually going out to talk to people and understanding like what it is actually like to experience extreme heat in your home, outside of your home, as you're commuting to work, as you're going to like a cool space or not.
Right. So this question goes to Caleb. Why is extreme heat often overlooked compared to flooding or storms, despite causing so many deaths each year?
So we mentioned a couple times already that the actual health impacts of extreme heat start at much lower temperatures than the emergency standard that's set by the National Weather Service. And part of that is because it doesn't account for the indoor temperatures that are related to urban heat islands. And like we have some pretty egregious examples of this across the country. There was actually no heat emergency declared despite how deadly these heat waves were. Thinking about Chicago in 1995 that had over 700 deaths in Oregon in 2021. And part of that too is that some of these heat waves or heat domes, um, it's an emerging threat that I don't think that everywhere we can say that uh, government always have a full grasp of how serious the threat is. But another piece of this too is I think in New York City, we're a little bit better positioned with this. But there's not currently a federal mandate on when or how to cite heat as a contributing factor. So it shakes out that if there aren't the necessary resources for health surveillance or guidance on how to code these deaths, that we end up really underestimating the scale at which people are dying from extreme heat. And we mentioned the invisibility of extreme heat, but because it's also something that is over such a long time scale, and there isn't always an immediate way to report how these damages show up in our lives. I think people don't necessarily draw connections as they're happening. So one example, like it is great news that the MTA is going to do the Thermal Energy Network project um, in partnership with the city. But just to understand that that's only one part of the issue that it impacts our transportation infrastructure. So the MTA's 2025 climate resilience report cites that there were 6 heat waves in that year that impacted power infrastructure and communications, which led to service delays and disruptions. And, especially if you're waiting on that hot platform, that increases your exposure. And also, we all need to get where we're going. Like everyone can relate to being frustrated by unreliable travel times. In addition to that, the train tracks are also being directly exposed to the heat and they're at risk of buckling, representing like a structural threat and a need for emergency repairs in some cases. Also, thinking about our workforce, it increases the risk of workplace accidents, particularly when we're reaching a heat index of 95 degrees or hotter. The likelihood is at around 8%. And looking at some data between 2015 and 2022, the city did an analysis, the local publication, the city, suggests that the official count of injuries associated with heat may be closer to 3,700 on 85-degree plus days between May and September, compared to the Worker Compensation Board data that estimated 420 between 2002 and 200 sorry, 2022. So just thinking about, again, there are all these factors that are sort of obscured or hard to track in the moment because of the chronic nature of extreme heat exposure. It doesn't have a clear start and end date necessarily in the same way that major storms do.
This question goes to Kat. So from a public health perspective, what have recent heat waves revealed about the challenges New Yorkers face in staying safe during heat waves or extreme heat? What actions can residents, community organizations, and city agencies take to reduce health risks and prevent heat-related illnesses and deaths?
Well, while we figure out how to really almost reconfigure and reinvest and almost like redo the built environment, to have more cooling or greener features that promote like climate and healthy activity that's accessible and everything and maintained, all of that. So I think that's one big aspect of mitigation that's there, but I think that there's also, the social and community aspect that we need to do. And so, for instance, when planning for an event, it's asking the questions, proactively thinking, is this event, for instance, going to take place on grass, dirt, or, things with environmental type features, or will it take place on the pavement? And of course, those answers are going to depend community by community. But it's just keeping in mind that of those risks that could take place and thinking like, okay, well, what can we do about that? Or is there going to be dancing? Is there going to be running? Is there going to be water-based activities? Just understanding the risk that happens during this time of year in particular. And really planning for it, but also involving local businesses or even private sector to be involved in making sure that there's somewhere to go to take like breaks, or there's somewhere that will have AC and will welcome people in their doors. And also training up community members on how to respond or almost see those signs and administer first aid. And precisely what Jada and Caleb are speaking of in terms of really documenting that experience of extreme heat in the streets. Because, well, government-wise, I have a lot to say about that, but I think in particular, just honing in on the question for sure. Yeah, on that.
Uh, Jessica, what are some of the city's priorities and initiatives to keep residents safe from extreme heat?
Yeah, so I feel like there's like no one size fits all solution. So I think we are definitely trying to think of how do we create cooling outside and how do we create kind of protections indoors. So for the outside component and just like general, how do we cool the city? We this year released the urban forest plan, which talks about reaching 30% canopy citywide by 2040. So we know there are some neighborhoods that have maybe like 7% canopy, 10%, 11%. And we know that Parks is actively planning and like trying to go to heat vulnerable neighborhoods, but we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to planting, to preserving, and really maintaining our tree canopy. We know that trees really truly provide like the most cooling that you can in terms of any interventions. So that's one. Two, with like in collaboration with like city council and we act and a lot of other kind of community groups, we passed like max indoor temp legislation last year that talks about providing AC access to every kind of unit across the city by 2035, I believe. And then we are doing things of like, how do we think about like providing cooling access, so shade structures for people, more misting. We are doing like a pilot around like a green roof bus shelter and some reflective tape in Brownsville this summer to really think about how are we thinking about traveling in the city and protecting people when they have to use kind of transit. Um, And then the big question is always like, how do we kind of build on what we're already doing? So better waterfront access, more access to pools, more cooling centers, pop-up cooling centers, things of that nature.
Caleb, what policy planning design changes are most urgently needed to support these initiatives?
Caleb, you're on mute.
Okay, there we go. I was like, why is it taking so long? So in terms of uh, policy solutions, I think I'm glad that Jessica brought up Local Law 23. I think that's a key part of adding a foundation that we say, in the same way that in winter, every household should have access to heating, that we have that same baseline for cooling. But the other component of it is making sure that people can turn on their cooling devices and use them to the extent necessary. So we've been doing a lot of advocacy around ensuring that programs like the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program are adequately funded to meet the need. And that's been a major challenge, especially in New York State, because by the time cooling season turns around, each year, I believe we get between 2 and 4% of the total LIHEAP budget for the cooling assistance benefit. And that means that about 20,000 or more or less people are served through the program. But we also run out routinely before we even get to July. And the Trump administration has consistently tried to eliminate funding for the LIHEAP program. But we're doing advocacy at the federal level to keep expanding appropriations. So that's our federal team, but we also work at the state level around supporting things like the Green Affordable Pre-Electrification Fund, which essentially it's in a pilot phase now, so we definitely want more funding than this. Originally, the language proposed 200 million. Right now, it's at 3 million. But what that funding would do is eliminate barriers to major weatherization and electrification upgrades to housing. And this is important because a lot of the barriers to state programs are things like mold, pests, roof repairs, that are health and safety issues that bar people from um, benefiting from energy efficiency, which ultimately lowers the amount of energy needed to heat and cool homes. And that is like the most durable long-term way to save money, even as with each rate case, utilities try to negotiate for higher and higher rates from residents. So that's a really important piece is thinking through how we're being charged for energy and pinning it on what the needs of the most vulnerable New Yorkers are. Yeah, I'll pause there because I feel like I could go on, but we'll keep it going.
Thank you. Jada, what community priorities should policymakers be listening to?
Yeah, for community priorities, something that often we experience on the ground doing this grassroots organizing, talking to to community members one-on-one, and in groups is the fact that, the language that we use to talk about environmental justice, climate justice issues, extreme heat, is often really policy and science heavy. And we have to also acknowledge that the day-to-day experiences that folks are having are also a form of, expert knowledge and expert information. And so when we come to folks about climate justice and extreme heat issues, they might be focused on a housing issue or a justice issue related to safety, protection from violence or protection from brutality, also access to food. We've had these issues with SNAP being rolled back. We've had, the presence of ICE in our communities. And so part of the community priorities are basic needs, like shelter, food, water, and also basic rights to not be, subject to brutality and violence. And so the best way to kind of do both things of having climate resilience is also making sure that people are fed and that people have places to live and that people can afford their living spaces, that people can send their kids to school. As a person who's focused on youth engagement and youth coordinating in the South Bronx for environmental justice education, one of the important things is just having these intergenerational conversations about the experience of extreme heat, about how things were in the past and how they're being felt now, and how we can help each other, how neighbors can check in on neighbors, but also grandkids can check in on grandparents and friends can check in on friends. I think that, you know, as the city is being more open and proactive to addressing climate threats, we really can't forget some of the baseline issues that folks experience that need to be addressed first before we can even have a conversation about climate justice and what that actually means. And when we meet people where they're at, when we hear and listen to issues about housing and community infrastructure and, policing, we can better connect about some of the ways that those issues are even exacerbated by something like extreme heat. There might be more policing and brutality in an open space if that's the only space that has enough tree canopy for people during really hot days. Or in food banks and food pantry places where people are getting what they need to eat. And so, the priorities are the same as they always have been, but creating a transferable lens where we can address these basic issues, with while also advancing the climate justice that we want to see, through our organizations, through the city, and also, you know, young people really, really care about extreme heat issues. It's something that we should be talking about in schools formally. We should be having climate justice curriculum that also includes, extreme heat protections and reaching out to our youth as a way to also share heat resilience information to an entire family. Because yeah, this is important information. This is information that keeps you healthy, but also keeps you informed. And if we aren't, prioritizing people's ability to actually take matters into their own hands and protect themselves as well, then then it's hard to have these community-based solutions that might leave someone out if they don't resonate with the term, climate justice or environmental justice or extreme heat.
No, thank you so much for sharing that. I really resonated with that, especially the intergenerational talk. So we have only time for one more question. And this is for everyone before we move on to questions from the audience. In one sentence, what does a heat-safe city look like 10 years from now? And whoever wants to start.
Where 500 deaths are zero.
That's the big one. I think that it's also about a city that prioritizes zero and low carbon cooling as first resort strategies alongside electrified, affordable, and grid conscious cooling for everybody.
I was going to say a city where people can live risk-free and full lives during the summer, but also the zero deaths for sure.
For me, a heat-safe city is an empowered city, a city that, is able to collaborate with the agencies that are working so hard to protect us from extreme heat, but also the individuals who are creating these small spaces within their communities to convene and to have health. And so, yeah, a heat safe city is an empowered city that's educated about the risks and can share that information with each other.
Love that. Thank you guys so much. So I have a couple of questions here from the audience. Amber from Epicenter, New York City. Hi, Amber. Since she said, appreciate this conversation, since older adults are one of the groups most at risk of complications and death due to extreme weather, and are also at risk of isolation due to factors such as mobility issues, ageism. What are initiatives in New York City you all know about that are helping older adults weather storms, extreme cold, and extreme heat? Also, that are helping inform older adults about ways to protect themselves and evacuation plans, and otherwise helping them better access resources for dealing with extreme weather. And then she also had a follow-up question, but I'll say it after you guys respond to that one.
Yes. So currently there is something, I'll start with what's new. So currently there's Link NYC that we see around the cities that are these digital kiosks. They display real-time walking directions that will lead you to the closest active cooling space. So that's new. And then also an emergency protocol that we have is that we have these outreach teams that are all throughout the agencies and that check on vulnerable older adults that are living in homes, but who are also on the street as well when it's really cold or really hot. And then there's also mobile like buses that are going around as well. And there's also something that's called Aging Connect. So it's for seniors or caregivers that need guidance or need to know where the closest, safest AC space is. And so it's like a dedicated hotline through New York City's Department of Aging. I can put the number in the chat if it's helpful. And yeah, and then there is also heap cooling program, but I think also I wanted to add, but I forgot earlier, is that I think federally we need to make heat a declarable disaster in order to activate additional funding to help us to be able to fund HEAP, to fund all of the solutions that Jessica and Caleb are proposing. So I think, does anyone know any other ones? Those are the ones that I've heard. Yeah. we put?
I mean, it sounded like you were also referring to Be a Buddy, right?
Oh yeah, that how can I forget about Be a Buddy? Yes. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, Be a Buddy, and feel free to chime in.
Sure, sure.
Buddy is a program that activates during severe weather emergencies where volunteers are then deployed to go check on socially isolated people and older adults, make sure that they're safe and connect them to information, resources, what have you. But also, I would say Notify NYC is another tool that helps close the sort of information gap there. You can sign up via email or text messages. That's I definitely respond more to text messages. And it applies to weather alerts, but also traffic emergencies, like a broad range of different like public service announcements. So it's useful to have that easily accessible to make emergency plans.
Also, on the New York City cool options map, there is an option to filter out the cooling spaces by uh, eligibility with age. So there are some places that are only open to older adults. And I know here in Mott Haven, Port Morris, East Side Settlement House is one of the cooling centers slash community centers that, opens its doors during extreme heat events, but also offers a lot of support services like counseling and physical fitness classes, mental health referrals, even emergency funds for utility bills, community workshops and projects. And so for older adults, finding those specific spaces that are focused on providing services to them, and oftentimes those community spaces are not just, an air-conditioned building, but have other health related and resilience related programming going on that people can tap into.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions that I really want to get to. Hi, my name is Stephanie, and I'm a civil engineering student at Hostos Community College, interested in how infrastructure can help address environmental and climate challenges in underserved communities. What role do you see for engineers in addressing extreme heat at the neighborhood scale? Are there specific infrastructure challenges or projects where the city needs more engineering innovation? Sorry.
Just to jump in, because I think this is such a great question. Thank you, Stephanie, for asking. Something that South Bronx Unite has been doing in kind of in partnership with the city and the urban forest plan is increasing green infrastructure on our streets and sidewalks. And part of that, beyond, planting street trees or installing rain gardens, is also creating and engineering some of the watering and maintenance like infrastructure around our tree pits to make sure that they can grow and that they can provide a lot of canopy and shade. So one of the things that we've been thinking about is how can we, you know, build something that's self-sustaining around a street tree that can water it or that can help retain water during, low rain periods or extreme heat days. So I think in terms of the maintenance of the green infrastructure that we so critically need, uh, there's a lot of potential for, scaling down like a water or energy system to make sure that on our sidewalks and streets we can be getting the benefits and the long-term benefits of green infrastructure.
Yeah, those are great points, Jada. I also look internationally for some inspiration here. Like, I don't think that it's not necessarily an innovation that hasn't been done before, but things like green awnings. There's cities in Spain where they have these sort of tension rod they're like sail-like structures, and they have vegetation on top that help shade narrow pedestrian infrastructure. Or I went to Vancouver recently, and Jada mentioned access to like misting, and a lot of the misting facilities are usually like play areas for small children. It might not be something that an unaccompanied adult wants to wander into. So someone else had a question about using um, community gardens. Like, how can we make sure that those spaces can be activated and potentially offer additional misting, especially because where community gardens are, they're so intermixed with residential areas and often close to where people are shopping, recreating, and areas that don't have adequate access to parks, which do have some of these misting stations. I think that's a pretty simple innovation that engineers, I think, could support with. And then there's a little bit of like a social engineer sort of lens to apply to this as well, because one thing that DEP has been encouraging people to do is use sprinkler caps on the fire hydrants. And there's a gap there in that people are not necessarily going to want to always call a firehouse to have it installed. But I think the city needs to think through like who are the people that are willing to take that role in their community and maybe proactively install those before people bust them off, and then there's a decrease in water pressure for the neighborhood, right? So thinking about like trusted messengers and who holds that responsibility in the neighborhood is another piece.
All right. Before we wrap up, Jessica, Kat, any final thoughts from you guys?
No, I would just say that I feel like there's a lot of good work that's happening both at the city and within communities. As many have said, like summers are going to continue to get hotter, and there's a lot more for us to do, a lot of ways for us to be creative and work together. So I do feel like we can find solutions that work for us that really are protecting people here. So I hope to see kind of more of that work continue and grow.
Yeah, definitely. I agree with that. Absolutely. And I love hearing from everybody on this panel. And I think in terms of like coordination and government agencies with recovery and resiliency and all these terms, I think it's like what Jada said earlier. It comes down to listening to communities really and empathetically and addressing the root causes of them, leveraging what's there in truth, and instead of starting from scratch and really, all of the things that she mentioned, like housing, policing, community infrastructure, all of these things. And so I think in terms of like preparedness and recovery, and this isn't just New York City, I think this is all around, it's community planning happens in a vacuum. And it's groups that have proximity to power that get the benefit of recovery. And you see this, we're seeing it play out in Gary, Indiana, right now before our eyes, right? And so it's in plain sight of who does the government prioritize and who gets to recover. And so I think on our end or internally, I think coordination wise, we have to think long term and be proactive and really have like community-centered solutions, absolutely. Like that's a big part of it, but it's also having the supportive leadership to just allow these conversations, letting folks into the room when they take place, and really honestly just being open to doing things that are different and just experimenting like what can be done or versus what's always been done. And really working together as agencies and what we can do and what we can bring to the table. And then, yeah, I really want to see how that would play out in these aftermaths for recovery wise. So that's all I really wanted to add. And thanks for inviting me. And I had a lot of fun listening to all of you in this panel.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for joining me. Just as someone from the South Bronx, um, doing the trying to do my best in being immersed in this climate justice work. Um, Me being from a or environmental justice neighborhood myself, and my nearest cooling center is almost 2 miles away from me. It's been a pleasure and an honor to have this conversation with you guys. So, with that being said, I guess that concludes this webinar.
Thank you, Soledad. And thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thanks, everybody. Take
Thank
care.
you all so much.
Thank you.
So,